So as we sort of wrap up our learning units here on macromolecules. So we've learned about the metabolism of carbohydrates, we learned about the metabolism of lipids, and we're going to close out here with the metabolism of proteins, and then our next learning unit is going to be nucleic acids. This was a good opportunity to sort of review from a high level standpoint what we know about these three important macromolecules. And I'm going to highlight as I go through things that carbohydrates and fats are primarily fuel molecules, whereas protein is not intended to be a fuel, it's really intended to be a building block. So with each of these, I'm going to sort of parallel the same things. We'll talk about them one at a time. First, we'll talk about carbohydrates, some structure that you need to know, some important numbers that I want you to know, and thinking about how we have or manage reserves of these important macronutrients in our bodies. So hopefully everybody's good. When we think about carbohydrates, we're thinking about glucose polymers. Again, we've had a lot of discussion about fructose. Again, fructose is not something that we need to have in our body, right? Most of the things that we need to have in our body can make themselves. So gluconeogenesis, we can make glucose. So this is sort of exclusively glucose focused in terms of when we think about carbohydrates. But hopefully everybody is good drawing our structure of glucose, right? So beta D glucose kind of being our most important carbohydrate. So we've got beta D glucose. And once you've drawn beta D glucose, just a little bit of a review here. Hopefully you're good recognizing that the C2 epimer is switching the OH at that position. That's going to generate mannose. C4 epimer is going to be switching the OH position there to make galactose. So we've got a lot of the important carbohydrates that we can think about by relating them to glucose. All right, so some important numbers to think about with glucose. Glucose is worth 4 calories per gram. We're going to talk about what the caloric value is of each of these. Glucose is our really important hydrophilic circulating fuel. So that's kind of what we want to remember. It is a hydrophilic circulating fuel. Right, and we talk about the importance in contrast to that in terms of lipids, but some other important numbers to think about, right? Physiological concentrations are 5 millimolar, which is 90 milligrams per deciliter, sort of as the floor of where we really want sort of our fasted sort of glucose levels to be. And when we think about sort of where we can tap into reserves when we don't have that level, right? We've got glycogen reserves. So glycogen reserves in muscle and liver, remembering that muscle glycogen is exclusive only for muscle use, whereas liver glycogen is for global use. So again, muscle is for local use only, liver is for global use, but really it's about a 12-hour reserve. We've got that reserve that can last us for about 12 hours before we really need to start ramping up gluconeogenesis. Now, it's not to say that this is some binary switch, but you don't immediately start doing gluconeogenesis as soon as your glucose levels fall. You might start trickling that in as you're starting to tap into your glucose reserve or your glycogen reserves. And again, it's not that you don't really start ramping up gluconeogenesis until your glycogen reserves are totally depleted. It's sort of a mutual sort of situation with both of those processes, that top-down and bottom-up approach to remedy low blood sugar. And just remembering that there are certain cells like red blood cells that rely exclusively on glucose because red blood cells lack mitochondria, and so to have those cells be able to produce their own energy, only having sort of cytosolic glycolytic processes, we need to make sure that we maintain that 5 millimolar blood sugar. Okay. So nice little brief review there of carbohydrates. Let's move on and review lipids. And specifically when we're talking about lipids, lipids is a catch-all for anything that is not water soluble. So when we're talking about dietary fats as a macromolecule, we're really specifically talking about triglycerides. So if we think about structures of triglycerides, right, we've got a glycerol backbone, 3-carbon backbone. If this was 3 OH groups there, then we'd be generating, or we would have glycerol. But we esterify glycerol to fatty acids. And again, we're going to have a certain number of carbon atoms there in our hydrophobic tail, our hydrocarbon tail there to generate certain size fatty acids. We talked about some of the specifics that we see with fatty acids. For what we have in our body, they tend to be even chains. We're going to have an even number of carbon atoms. We can have saturated ones, as we've shown here. We also can have unsaturated fatty acids. And again, highlighting that we are going to have cis double bonds there. We can have any number of sort of repeats of those. We're never going to have those double bonds in conjugation. We cannot make the omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids. Even though I've not properly shown it here, we're never going to see double bonds before 9 carbons away from that carbonyl carbon. So lots of details that we talked about in our lipid learning unit. Again, just drawing one more in here just to finish out our triglycerides. We'll draw another fatty acid that is saturated there. These are our triglycerides, sometimes just abbreviated TGs. But thinking about the caloric value of these are 9 calories per gram. So a couple reasons why they are worth more is they are less oxidized than carbohydrates are. So on that oxidation continuum from fully reduced hydrocarbons to fully oxidized carbon dioxide, they are further along the reduced side of that spectrum. So we are able to squeeze more energy out of them. So gram per gram, that's one of the reasons why they are worth more than carbohydrates. Another thing to think about is because carbohydrates are so hydrophilic, they actually are going to keep a lot of water retained with them. So not only do we have to think about the mass of the carbohydrate when we're storing it, and we don't get as much energy out of it, but then we're going to have all of the associated water that just adds to the overall bulk and mass, that it's not efficient for your body to store a lot of excess energy as carbohydrate. So this is nature's favorite hydrophobic storage fuel. So again, this is a favorite hydrophobic storage fuel, right? So we've got hydrophilic circulating, hydrophobic storage, and hopefully you remember that when we talked about our lipid learning unit, we talked about the ability to take triglycerides, and by breaking them down to acetyl-CoA, we can reassemble those acetyl-CoAs to make ketone bodies, which are water soluble. So we can take that very efficient hydrophobic storage fuel and make it into a hydrophilic circulating fuel like ketone bodies, which can be circulated throughout the body. But things like red blood cells are not going to be able to utilize those because ketone bodies ultimately get converted back into acetyl-CoA, and you have to have mitochondria in order to deal with acetyl-CoA in the citric acid cycle. Okay, so some important sort of numbers to think about. The only numbers that we really talked about is when we're talking about ketone bodies, that we talked about concentration of ketone bodies in the range of 0.5 millimolar to about 5 millimolar is what we're going to call nutritional ketosis. And these are healthy levels of ketone bodies. Once you start getting above 5 millimolar, even close to that, you might start having some metabolic acidosis sort of situations, and that can be problematic, having that drop in pH from having too many ketone bodies. Okay, but when you are able to put yourself in this nutritional ketosis state, we say that you are a fat burner. And that metabolic flexibility is so important to overall health. Being able to have your cells at any moment be able to take glucose in as a fuel, or taking fatty acids or ketone bodies in as a fuel, means you've got metabolic flexibility. And having that metabolic flexibility is really key to overall metabolic health. So kind of moving along here in parallel and thinking about sort of reserves that we have of adipose tissue, right, of lipids, of triglycerides. So we have reserves in adipose tissue, right, which is really our fat, right? And then this is really unlimited in the amount of reserve we have. And even in a healthy adult with a healthy sort of body mass index really can have about 2 to 3 months of energy reserve in adipose tissue. Now, of course, this is assuming that you're consuming the micronutrients that you need, you have adequate hydration and so forth, but you have quite a lot of energy reserve stored in adipose tissue. All right, so that's a review. Learning units that we've already had on carbohydrate metabolism. Now we've got lipid metabolism, protein metabolism, and we'll round out sort of that last piece that will comprise sort of your last exam, which will be on nucleic acid metabolism. So I'll probably refer back to this video because the only piece we're going to add on then to it is thinking about nucleic acid metabolism, which really isn't an intended fuel metabolism. So when we think about proteins, right, the big piece is to think about how we string proteins together, and we're going to have peptide or amide linkages, but we want to think about the general structure of any amino acid, because that's going to become important for us to think about how we are going to metabolize amino acids. So every amino acid, again, having an amino group, a carboxy group. That's why they're called amino acids, an amino group and a carboxylic acid group. And then what differentiates all of our amino acids is whatever that R group that's kind of appended to that alpha carbon. So again, proteins are ultimately broken down into amino acids. Okay, drawing some parallels across here, we are thinking about these being worth 4 calories per gram. Okay, and so we don't really have physiological levels or concentrations that we need to maintain of these because they're not intended to be something that's a circulating anything. So we really don't have that these are sort of a hydrophilic circulating fuel or a hydrophobic storage fuel. These really are building blocks. So they're not intended to be consumed from a sort of energy or a fuel standpoint. So we really don't have numbers to sort of think about. So I'm going to kind of put a red line there that we don't have concentrations or magic numbers that we sort of need to think about in terms of amino acids or protein. Okay. But one of the things that we do want to think about is reserves that we have. And the reserves that we sort of have for proteins and amino acids are really unintended. So unintended reserves. Okay, and what do I mean by that? If you needed some amino acids and you aren't consuming proteins, you need to get them from somewhere. And we'll talk about why you need to have those amino acids in just a moment. But really, your liver and your kidney are going to be the first sort of tissues that will atrophy when needed. So they're really an unintended reserve. It's not the desire and the goal to sort of tap into and decrease the volume of either your kidney or your liver. But those are the first tissues that are going to atrophy if you need to tap into and get access to some amino acids. So your liver and your kidney are the first to atrophy. So again, that's unintended. So atrophy when needed. And so why would you need them? Well, again, maybe it's an energy, okay, or a glucose sort of standpoint. Okay, you can take glucogenic amino acids and by gluconeogenesis make the glucose that you need. Make a bigger arrow kind of coming over here, right? Gluconeogenesis is going to allow us to make some of the glucose that we need to satisfy a low blood sugar level. So even though we've talked about that bottom-up approach, right, it's really using glucogenic amino acids as building blocks, non-carbohydrate precursors to make that glucose. The other thing that you might need, right, is it maybe it's not just energy or glucose, or maybe it's both, but you might need many amino acids which are used to make important either metabolites or other proteins. So if you need those building blocks, and we'll get into the details of this, but out of the 20 sort of naturally occurring amino acids, 10 of them are essential. We need to consume them from our diet, but for those 10 that are not essential, meaning we can make them ourselves, we can kind of convert other alpha keto acids into those. But those ones that are essential, if we're not consuming things in our diet, we might need to be breaking down these unintended reserves to get access to those building blocks to build the proteins that we need to do our biochemistry or build the metabolites that we need to be doing many of our biochemical functions. Okay, so that's hopefully a overview of carbohydrates and lipids, specifically triglycerides and glucose, and then sort of a comparison to things that we're going to see with proteins. Remembering that proteins are not intended to be a fuel. They can be broken down at 4 calories per gram, but the purpose of protein consumption is as building blocks to be able to make lots of other proteins or other metabolites.